Yakuza finger removal, yubitsume. In the world of the Japanese Yakuza, mistakes weren't corrected with apologies. They were corrected with a knife. This punishment was called yubitsume, literally finger shortening. If you failed your boss or disrespected the code, you weren't beaten or killed. Instead, you were handed a blade and expected to slice off your own little finger. The idea wasn't just about pain. By cutting off a finger, you weakened your grip on a sword, making you more dependent on your gang for protection. It was punishment, humiliation, and control, all wrapped into one bloody ritual. And here's the twisted part. If you kept messing up, the process continued. First one joint, then another, until eventually your hand was little more than a stump. It wasn't death, but in some ways it was worse. A permanent mark of shame, carried with you every time you reached for a cup, opened a door, or shook someone's hand. LINGCHI, death by 1,000 cuts. If yubitsume was about losing a finger, LINGCHI was about losing everything. The name translates to death by 1,000 cuts, and it was one of the most infamous punishments in Imperial China. The setup was grimly theatrical. The condemned was tied upright in a crowded square. Then came the executioner, blade in hand, with a job description that can only be called creative dismemberment. The first cuts were small, slices of skin, pieces of flesh shaved away almost delicately. But as the minutes dragged on, the cuts grew deeper, muscles, tendons, even whole limbs. The goal wasn't speed, the goal was agony, stretched out as long as possible while the victim stayed alive. And here's where it gets darker. Sometimes victims were dosed with opium so they wouldn't faint, forcing them to stay awake for every single cut. Imagine the horror of drifting in and out of consciousness, only to wake up mid-slice. LINGCHI wasn't just about punishment, it was about erasing honor. In Chinese tradition, the body was sacred, a gift from your parents. To die mutilated meant you'd lose dignity not only in this world, but in the afterlife. In other words, LINGCHI didn't just kill you, it canceled your existence. This nightmare wasn't some medieval rumor either. It was real, practiced for centuries. And the last officially recorded LINGCHI took place in 1905. That means it was still being used just over 100 years ago. Not ancient history, but practically yesterday. SCAPHISM, the boats. If you thought LINGCHI was brutal, the Persians had a punishment that turned your body into lunch. It was called SCAPHISM, or more chillingly, the boats. The victim was trapped between two hollowed-out wooden canoes, with only their head, arms, and legs sticking out. Sounds like an uncomfortable tanning bed, right? But here's where it gets nightmarish. The executioners force-fed you milk and honey until you couldn't swallow anymore. Then they smeared the rest across your exposed skin, turning you into a sticky buffet for every insect in sight. Boiling alive. If you thought scaphism was the worst way to go, history wasn't done cooking up ideas. Literally. One of the most terrifying punishments across Europe and Asia was boiling alive. Criminals were thrown into massive cauldrons filled with water, oil, or even molten lead. Sometimes they were lowered slowly, inch by inch, so the crowd could watch a skin blister peel and fall away before the victim even lost consciousness. This wasn't some fringe torture either. In the 1500s, England made boiling the official punishment for poisoners. Imagine being condemned and knowing your final destination was a human stew pot. The brutality was public theater. The screams, the smell, the bubbling flesh, all designed as a warning. Betray society and you'll become dinner for the fire. Quick, merciful deaths, forget it. Boiling alive was execution mixed with performance art, and the audience got front row seats. The Brazen Bull. If hell had a mascot, it would be the Brazen Bull. This ancient Greek invention looked like a massive statue of a bull, cast entirely from bronze. But it wasn't built for decoration. It was built for death. The condemned would be locked inside the hollow belly of the bull. A fire was lit underneath, turning the entire statue into a metal oven. Slowly, the victim roasted alive as the bronze grew hotter and hotter. But here's the twisted genius. The bull wasn't just a torture device, it was sound engineering. Pipes were built into the mouth so that the screams of the burning victim would echo out as the roar of a bull. Imagine being part of the crowd, hearing what sounded like an animal bellowing, only to know it was actually a human being cooked alive inside. The brazen bull wasn't just execution, it was execution as entertainment. And that's the part that still makes it one of history's most sadistic punishments. The breaking wheel, Catherine wheel. If roasting in a metal bull wasn't enough, medieval Europe had another crowd favorite, the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. The method was as theatrical as it was brutal. First, the victim was tied across a giant wagon wheel, arms and legs spread wide. Then came the executioner, wielding a heavy iron club. One by one, he smashed bones, arms, shins, thighs, carefully avoiding vital organs so the victim stayed alive through every break. When the body was fully shattered, the executioner would twist the mangled limbs between the spokes of the wheel, bending them in ways no human body should ever bend. The wheel was then hoisted upright like a grotesque billboard of suffering, left to the elements while crows and dogs feasted on what remained. Sometimes death took hours, sometimes days, and the longer the victim lived, the greater the lesson it taught to the crowd. The punishment became legendary because of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. According to Christian tradition, when she was sentenced to the wheel in the 4th century, the device miraculously shattered at her touch. Instead of being broken, she became a symbol, and the wheel carried her name ever since. But for the less fortunate, the wheel didn't break, it broke them. A rolling reminder that in medieval Europe, justice often came with splintered bones and a slow, public death. Rat torture. Rat torture turned one of the world's most adaptable pests into a living weapon. The setup was cruelly simple. A rat was placed inside a cage or bucket, then strapped against the bare stomach or chest of the victim. Heat was applied to the other end, fire, hot coals, even just a torch. And rats, being rats, did what they do best: escape. But the only way out was through flesh, through organs, through whatever stood between them and freedom. Victims weren't just tortured, they were eaten alive from the inside out. This wasn't some fringe idea either. Records describe versions of it across Europe, South America, and even Imperial China. The common thread? Everyone knew how terrifying rats were, and everyone knew they'd do anything to survive. Rat torture didn't require fancy devices or genius inventors. It was just nature pressed against your body. The blood eagle. According to the Norse sagas, this was a punishment reserved for only the most hated traitors and enemies. The executioner would carve open the victim's back, severing the ribs from the spine and spreading them outward like grotesque wings. Then came the final act, dragging out the lungs and draping them across the shoulders to complete the image of a crimson, flapping eagle. It was said the victim had to remain alive through the process, forced to feel every rib snap, every breath turning into fire as the lungs were exposed to the cold air. A gruesome spectacle meant to terrify enemies and impress the gods with blood. The most famous victim? King Ella of Northumbria, captured by Viking leaders in 867 after killing Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary warrior whose death demanded revenge. Saga accounts claim Ella was executed with the blood eagle, his body transformed into a living warning to anyone who dared oppose Ragnar's sons. Historians still debate whether the Blood Eagle ever truly happened, or if it was medieval writers exaggerating Viking cruelty. Some argue it was symbolic, a poetic description of a brutal stabbing. But here's the truth: whether literal or legend, the fear was real. The story alone spread terror across Europe. Because when your enemies believe you can rip open their back and turn their lungs into wings, you don't just win battles, you win minds. So yeah, from boiling people alive to feeding them to rats, history's punishments were nightmares come true. But here's the twist: the people ordering these tortures weren't just judges or executioners. They were kings, men who ruled with crowns on their heads and cruelty in their hearts. If you think the punishments were bad, wait until you meet the kings who invented them. Click the video right here on the most evil kings in history explained, and see just how far absolute power really corrupted. Thank you very much for watching this video, and goodbye.